It was in 99% of pubs and bars in its heyday. And it's arguably redefined the way women were able to drink in these pubs, back then very male-dominated pubs and bars.
Hello, my name is Ria Wincaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world.
Hip, hip, hooray!
That was Nick Showering bringing us into episode 425 of Cider Chat, talking about the shift in the drink culture for UK pubs when the Showering family introduced a sparkling perry called Babycham. And if you're in the cider world and you've been a fan of the history of cider as it has evolved around the world, I'm sure you've heard about Babycham. You're going to hear a little bit more about it. This is not the main theme of the conversation. It's really about Nick Showering, the family known as the Showerings, their legacy, not only with Babycham, but also in terms of being a producer of cider for the past over 100, close to 190 years in the same area of Somerset, England. The history is absolutely fascinating. And what are they doing today? Well, Nick is going to be sharing with you this new cider that he and his family have developed, and it's out on the shelves now, how you could get it, what it tastes like. We go through a little bit of a tasting, and kind of the excitement for me in this episode is hearing both the perspective of the new cider called the Triple Vintage, and also in Cider Chat, we talk to a lot of folks who are part of a family, some who are, hundreds of years old and keeping 100-year-plus old company going. And when you are part of a generational family business, how do you enter into that? Boy, you can only imagine the pressure that is on in that way. So it was really nice to hear his perspective on that, how he's managing it, how it's moving forward, and some really key observations in that whole business aspect of working with family. And of course, talking about the Triple Vintage cider that is out now. Stay tuned for that featured conversation with Nick Showering coming right up. But first, a wee bit of news from out and about in Ciderville. Cider Chat is listener supported, so it was really great to see that we have another patron signed up at the Cider Chat Patreon page, and that would be Martha, who's based up in Ontario and is a commercial cider maker. She is both a cider maker at Wood Folk Cider, that's their own farm there, and also at Spy Cider House and Distillery, where they're making apple brandy and cider, and also, I believe, brewing. Both of these cideries are right on like the lower edge of Lake Huron, which dips down into the U.S., but also kicks up north and kind of hangs over, if you will, the city of Toronto in Ontario. And that whole region there is just a wonderful apple growing region. There's a lot of very fine cider makers. So if you're up in that area, do check out both Spy Cider House and Distillery and Wood Folk Cider. And she wrote, "Sorry it took me so long to become a patron. I should have ages ago." Well, I'm not going to hold that against you, Martha. It definitely sounds like you are super, super busy doing everything at both Wood Folk Cider and the Spy Cider Works. She does write that she loves the geeky topics on the podcast. It really helps makers really up their game the more they know about techniques. And I hope that you were totally geeking out on the most recent episode, which is part 3 of a series with John Bunker. He wrote Apples and the Art of Detection. And the most recent episode, 424, was all on describing apples phenotypically. It is a masterclass, as was part 2, which was essentially finding out about an unknown apple and how you could categorically go through to identify via DNA testing and some of the discrepancies that he figures is pretty much part and parcel in every nursery, and I would say every nursery in the world, that there are some discrepancies in what is actually being produced and what it actually is. So he goes through all that. A wonderful series. You could all check it out on Cider Chat, and do know that his entire presentation slideshow is synced with the audio on YouTube. So that one is for you, Martha, and everyone out there. And you too can become a patron just like Martha. Just go to the Cider Chat Patreon page. That's spelled Patreon, or hit the donate button at ciderchat.com.
Walking through the orchards.
This episode releases just a few days shy of the official start of fall 2024. In the Southern Hemisphere, you are just a few days shy of spring. Yeah, blossom season is on its way. If you're down in Australia or down in Latin America, I hope it is spectacular. And the blooms stay on and the fruit is ample. Either way you dice it, it means for you out there in Ciderville that we are back to our weekly programming of every single week. And shoot, there's just so much good news coming on. And we get to kick it off with this wonderful conversation with Nick. And while it's being released this week, the week of September 15th, I am currently in France. Yes, I've been in France for just a little bit, getting prepared for the French cider tour, so I could welcome in everyone coming in from all different parts of the globe to attend that tour. We meet up in Paris. Ooh la la, I cannot wait, especially on the heels of the Paris Olympics, which just a blast to follow along on, and again, to watch all those drone shots. I just loved seeing the city. Going to take a little river ride down the Seine, and maybe I'll get some kind of bling on my chest so I could kind of be like an Olympic athlete, kind of get the vibe there. Either way, I'll probably have a cider in hand, just enjoying the scene. And then on the flip side of this tour, I am very pleased to announce that I am headed to the UK.
Hooray!
You'll be hearing Nick and I talk a little bit about Bob Cork, who has been making cider for 40 years, working with the Showering family. So at the end of this conversation with Nick, do stay tuned, because I'll update you with some news I have about that trip over to the UK, namely to share with you why is it that Cider Chat is headed to the UK, besides enjoying some amazing cider. Stay tuned for that. But in the meanwhile, it is my cue now to graciously invite you to grab a glass and enjoy this conversation with Nick Showering of Showering Cider, based in the town of Shepton Mallet in Somerset, England.
Our family, the Showerings, have been in a town in Somerset, England for over 400 years. The family was traced back to a man called Gabriel, and that's the furthest back we can go. But it was 180 years ago that the family first got into cider making and the drinks industry. And it started with a pub in Shepton Mallet called the Ship Inn. The pub today doesn't operate as a pub, but it's still across the road from where our mill is. So we really haven't gone far. We've traveled about 20 feet, which isn't very far to go. And that's where it all started, really. It started with one pub, and my ancestors started making cider from that pub, and it sort of grew from there, really. They eventually had a good small collection of pubs. They were selling the cider that they were making locally in Somerset, and it's expanded from there over the past 180 years. So I'm in quite a fortunate position where I've had this knowledge of cider making kind of instilled in me and handed down through generations, which is very, very fortunate. It's a sort of a money can't buy asset to have. I'm very fortunate to still be working with my father and uncles, and my brothers and cousin are in the business. And it's still very much an independent family business, which these days is very rare. So something to be cherished.
Mm-hmm. What is your role at Showering?
So my personal journey was the classic education of school. I then went to university to study philosophy. And I think it's very important with a family business that you don't dive straight in, because my father's always pushed the agenda that you need to go elsewhere to learn about how other people operate so that you can bring that knowledge back to the business. And so after university, I went and practiced and honed my selling skills for another drinks brand for a couple of years. I then went and studied my accountancy and became a chartered accountant, working for 4 years at a Somerset accountancy firm, which just gives you a wealth of knowledge for how a business ought to be run and the mechanics of how businesses work. And it was after that that I came back to the family business and actually was working in a more financial role. And not to say I wasn't well suited to it, but I didn't think it was really matching my skill set. And so a few years after working in finance at the family business, my father said, well, look, why don't you come and sort of steer the ship on our Showerings triple vintage and our most prestigious brand, and do the sort of sales and marketing, if you like, for that. So I've been given the full reins for Showerings triple vintage cider, which is great fun, actually, and I'm very passionate about. So for the past 2 years, I've been doing that. And that's how I've ended up here. And I feel it's very fulfilling, this idea of introducing people, or reintroducing people, I should say, to fine ciders and how the potential that they have.
I think it's also interesting that you're a young man. I know the cider industry overall is really looking for how do you get the younger folks interested to coming into cider making and continuing on for the family tradition. But was there a little bit like, oh, I didn't want to be part of it initially? I mean, is cider sexy? Is that like a cool business model right now to be involved in? That's a big question here. There's a lot of momentum we're seeing worldwide right now with cider. And I'm just, from your perspective, how did you approach that coming back into the family's envelope, so to speak?
Good question. I think, well, given the family history, I like to think that cider's always sexy. So that's an agenda I always push. And it's a very interesting question. So it's almost twofold. I think there's a principle there and an interesting angle to do with family businesses, not just related to drinks or cider. But when you're coming in and you're younger, you maybe have a bit of a desire and a feeling to sort of prove to yourself and prove to others that you can go out and achieve something on your own. But you've got to be very careful not to take for granted the opportunity that you have, that you're fortunate enough to have, which I'm in a position that I do. And so perhaps when I was younger, I did have feelings of, oh, I want to go off and do my own thing and prove to myself I can do that. But as I've got a little bit older and worked elsewhere, I've found my feet a little bit. And as long as I've got a bit of creative control within the family business to put my input and my stamp, then I'm perfectly happy. And I think understanding the hierarchy of a family business is very important as well. And acknowledging the fact that the hard work and effort that's been put in before you by your elder generations, and not to disregard that, because no matter how clever you think you are, you can't replace experience. So always respecting what the elder generation have done and are doing, and just trying to work within that. And in terms of cider itself and its perhaps reconnaissance that it's having, I think it's incredibly exciting, because especially in the UK where we're based, cider has suffered for the past 40, 50 years of quite brutal cost-cutting exercise and brands competing with themselves and each other based on price. So they're fighting for supermarket shelves and draft fonts in pubs and bars based on price. And what that means is the quality of the cider suffers. So if someone's trying to sell you a keg of cider, well, let's just say £100, the only way you can get it in is if you can sell it to them for £90. And what that defaults to is a cost-cutting exercise. So you then go back to the fermentations, the sourcing of the apples, and say, where can we cut costs? So it's been quite a brutal few years of that exercise happening. And with Showerings triple vintage, we've actually flipped it on its head and thought, we're going to make a no expense spared cider here. We're going to do what we need to do, see how much it ends up costing us, and that's how much we're going to charge. And so this idea of being led and decisions being led based on quality rather than cost, I think is what really differentiates us. And we're seeing it. Cider is one of those markets. It's been there forever, and I don't think it's going anywhere. And I know that there are trends within drinks that come and go, and they are, as you say, but perhaps a little bit sexier. Maybe like at the moment, the low and no category, the ready-to-drink cocktails are very popular in the UK. But what I find the most exciting is reinvigorating and reinventing within an established market. And you mentioned the craft beer movement. it's actually a lot of similarities can be drawn to what we're trying to do with the fine cider category. You know, you look at beer, when craft beer suddenly had its boom, it was again, a market that's been around forever, really. And there was innovation within that. And I think that's what's really exciting to me, that people forget that you can still innovate within a very established market. And that's what we're trying to do with cider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yet I find your triple vintage, I know there's innovation involved, but it feels like it's going back to the grassroots, and in the fact that you have like a really standalone cider that exemplifies what the apple can do. Are you still making other cider brands, some more like modern styles? Is that true?
So
The company in general?
as a wider business, we do work with other cider makers. So we have the facilities to press for local farmers. So we do that. Other local growers that we don't necessarily use apples, but we will press them for them and store them. So locally, we do a lot of work there. We have had successes with other brands in the past, which we still sort of manage and maintain a little bit. But for me, the focus is very much on showering. So that's 100% the day job for me. But we do work with other local growers. There's sometimes quite a lot of crossover in the Somerset region for that.
Sure. I mean, it makes sense. A business has to be diversified. And if you want to especially start moving a particular product, such as the triple vintage, you're coming back with all the history that you have behind you and all those other tools. So this is not unusual in the market. The cider mill is like one of the largest cider mills in the country, if not the largest right now in that area. So, of course, you're going to be doing quite a bit there. I know we want to talk about the triple vintage and get in that, but this is kind of stuff that everybody's kind of curious about because of the legacy of your family. So let's get into that a little bit more in terms of just bringing the listeners up to date here with how some of these particular elements came for the Showering family in general. Well known for Babycham. I mean, that was a premier product coming out around the 50s. Beautiful brand packaging at that time with a little reindeer, and it screams drink me, and sexy, a very sexy product too. And we'll have some photos up in the show notes for that particular product. That was a Perry, we should say sparkling Perry.
Absolutely. So Babycham was a big part of our family history, in the fact that it was really in the 50s that things probably went to the next level. So we were very regional cider makers, I would say, from that period of 180 years ago, starting with the Shepton pub in Somerset, England, all the way to the 50s, which is when the family really had some successes with brands, and that came through Babycham. And like you said, it was a very elegant bottle, and really that brand helped us get to the next level. And the mill that we are in today is still where all the Babycham was made back in the heyday. And that's really why we have one of the biggest and best mills, is because my ancestors apparently couldn't put in the tank space and the bottling lines quick enough to keep up with the demand of Babycham. There were stories of tanks being delivered and being used and set up before they roofed them. So it was that desperate that tanks were coming in. They hadn't put the warehouses up around it, but they were like, no, we just got to use it. And Babycham was, I believe it had up to something crazy like 99% on-trade listings in the UK. So it was in 99% of pubs and bars in its heyday. And it arguably redefined the way women were able to drink in these pubs, back then very male-dominated pubs and bars, because the drinks that were on offer were either pints of beer or hard spirits. You didn't have these options of sparkling wines or Prosecco's or cocktails. They just didn't exist. So if a woman went to the pub, they had to drink a pint or spirits, and neither at the time were that socially acceptable. Babycham then came along and said, look at this beautiful, cute little bottle. I'll serve it in a coupe champagne glass. And it was very elegant. So it sort of gave, I think, women an opportunity to be sitting in the pub alongside a man drinking a pint, and they could acceptably be drinking a Babycham. So it really helped diversify the pub scene in the UK, which is something we're very proud of. It was then on the back of Babycham the successes of that the family were able to expand in a business sense and buy up other brands, actually. So we ended up being involved in things like Harvey's, Baskin Robbins, many other cider companies, and had real success. And it was in the late 70s or early 80s, I believe, that sort of came to a close, because it then formed into a very large company and merged with a company called Allied and became a company called Allied Domecq, which back then was a very big company. And then unfortunately, my grandfather, Keith Showering, he passed away very young. He was chairman of Allied Domecq, and he passed away at a meeting at the Bank of England at the age of 52. He had a heart attack, unfortunately. And it was at that point that the family sort of stepped away from that business. And then we went back in Somerset and almost started again, really.
Wow. Well, I think it's also be very key for listeners to know where Somerset is located, for those who are geographically needing a little bit of push along. So it's West Country. It's to the west of London, and Herefordshire to the top area, that part of West Country. And then Somerset is Bristol going south.
Yeah, that's correct. So Somerset, England, is the southwest of England. We're about 40 minutes drive south of the city of Bristol. The UK is, I don't know the stats, but it always has been the biggest cider consuming country in the world.
Still
and
is.
There we go. The southwest of England is the biggest region for cider consumption. It almost competes with the amount of beer sold. So the southwest of England really is the heartland of cider, not only for consumers, but also, I think if you ask anyone where's the home of cider, they will default to Somerset. It's just associated with being the home of cider. And obviously within the UK, you've got other regions, like you said, Hereford. You've got the east of England, which makes a slightly different style of cider. But Somerset, I mean, I'm going to say it as well, but I would say the majority of people you ask, they say Somerset is really the home of cider. And so we're positioned in the best place. And we are literally in the heart of Somerset and always have been. And what that does, interestingly, is not only do you get the right conditions in the same way that you have for Champagne, and the terroir and the soil and the sloping hills and the right amount of sun, you actually have the same for cider. And that's what a lot of people don't realize, is that because cider is made in a very similar way to wine, it's just a fermentation of apples rather than grapes, all of those aspects are just as important. So, the soil that we have, the amount of sun that we get, the amount of rain that we get, the sloping hills, all of these things are essential to the growing of good cider apples. So we're in the right place. And on top of that, it's also the knowledge that's in the area. So if you were to, for some reason, you wanted to start making cider in the northeast of England, you would just struggle, I think, to find the right people to help you do that. But in Somerset, and where we are, there's an incredible amount of cider knowledge in the area. So if our head cider maker, Bob Cork, who's been with the family for 40 plus years, if he were to retire, I'm not saying he's replaceable, because he's quite irreplaceable, but there are other people in the area who can fit in. So it's more of a logistical point, but it is still very important.
Can you give us a little bit of the visual landscape if you're coming down from Bristol, and as you come into the area, would one expect to see a lot of orchards, or is the region also being impacted like so many other regions in the world where development is happening and there is less orchards and they're kind of being pushed up against the developer?
Well, Somerset is quite flat, so there aren't too many hills. You've got the Mendip Hills, which is quite hilly, but you don't get the height. But there are a lot of orchards in Somerset. So if you know where to look, you can find them. And there was quite a big news piece recently that Heineken, who own Strongbow, they ripped up a very big bunch of their trees. I can't remember exactly where it was. I feel like maybe it was in Wales, which was sad to see. But interestingly, on that point of orchards and repurposing them for development, the way that the commercial apple growers work in the UK is they will contract themselves to a brand for the length of time that the tree will bear fruit. So what you find is, if you have a commercial grower, they will be in contract with a someone like Strongbow or Heineken for the length of time that their apples will bear fruit. And in the UK, around 2006, 2007, I believe, there was a real boom in cider by the pint in pubs through Magners. People were drinking Magners in bottles served in pint glasses with ice. And that surge in demand triggered a lot more apple trees to be grown. And because obviously it's then a 30-year project. So at that point, there were a lot more orchards being grown, and a lot of those orchards are still in existence. So I would say there's actually quite a lot of orchards in the UK at the moment.
I'm sure, but it's always pushing up against it. Like you said, that 500 acres was devastating to read, but that's why we're so happy with what you're doing here with the triple vintage. Can I ask, a lot of the trees, are they high density trees?
They are high density, I'd say, but unfortunately this year in the UK, it's a very bad year for the apples. As your listeners may know, apple trees are almost biannual. So one year you'll get a bumper crop. The second year you will not get as many apples. And that's why we prune every winter, to try and balance that out. We've been very fortunate and had 3 years of very, very good amount of apples and a high yield. But this year, I mean, we're down to a third on our normal. And I think it's just what happens, and it's nature, and you can't fight it. But it's a shame, because the blossoms that we get in the spring are normally stunning. I mean, it's incredible to see. But this year I went to have a look, and it was just, you barely see any blossom. And again, I was in the orchards last week, and the trees are looking very bare. But for us, we're quite fortunate because we are a triple vintage. We are aging vintages back to 2017, which means we can obviously, when we come to make a new batch of the triple vintage, we can draw upon the older vintages where we may have a bit more stock. So I think 2024 will go down as a very small yield, and we will have very little of it. But we're fortunate that with our triple vintage method, we are able to draw on the older vintages.
So let's talk about the inspiration then for the triple vintage. And I'm going to grab this bottle here behind me, just to kind of bring it up forward on the screen. This is the triple vintage here. And this one is particularly from 2021, 2022, and 2023. And as we know, a lot of methods from winemaking, Solero, where you're kind of adding on from each year. But I have a sense that that's not necessarily how you're making the triple vintage. So I'd like to get a little bit into that. I first actually, though, like to go to the inspiration, like after all this, and now here you are, Nick, like doing this amazing, it's like the voice we want to hear happening out there in the world for cider. What up? Like, how did this come about?
I think the triple vintage idea came, my father came up with the idea because he saw that triple vintage was a wine technique that was being used, where you isolate and age different vintages, so different years, and when you come to make a batch, you blend 3 together that you think work well together. And what that does is it gives you a little bit more control over the final product and the final liquid. So the older years are deeper in color, they've got more depth of flavor, and the younger years are a little bit lighter and elegant. So you can really balance the older vintages, the depth, the complexity, the amount of challenge that there is to the drink, with elegance and youth. And it just gives you a little bit more control. And for example, if you do get a year like this year, where there are less going to be a smaller yield of fruit, you can also balance that out. But I think it's amazing because when you do try the showering cider, you do get a real sense of the depth, but it's not over challenging. And that's because we like to introduce a younger vintage just to balance that out. And I think that's a very important point, because Bob Cork, who's our cider maker, and he's a connoisseur of cider, he always pushes for the showerings to be more challenging, more depth of flavor, more Somerset style, more sort of almost scrumpier, farmier. And what I'm very passionate about is maintaining an accessibility to showerings, because yes, I want cider drinkers to drink this, but what really excites me is the idea of someone who says, "Oh no, I don't drink cider. I've never really liked it. Well, try this. Try it alongside some food at home when you're cooking, and introduce a wine drinker to cider, and not to replace wine, because I absolutely love you can't beat red and white. It's absolutely incredible alongside some food, but as an alternative, as a credible alternative, to sort of for the adventurous drinker and foodie to try a little something else, or if you have a dinner party, serve a cider alongside the food you're cooking. It's a nice way, and I think the consumer, especially in England, they're quite adventurous, and they don't mind trying things that are a little bit outside of the norm. So I think it's quite a cool alternative to offer cider to your guests when you're hosting instead of wine. It's just a nice thing. So that's what really excites me. So in order to do that, I'm always ensuring that the cider isn't too challenging, because I want someone without a traditional cider palate to also enjoy showerings.
Got it. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And, how exciting that you are able to have these different vintages and all that. Like you said, your cider maker, Bob Cork, having his history there. Just to bring listeners up to date, when Nick is talking about scrumpy, it's kind of like a traditional style in the UK, a wild yeast style, could be kind of a cloudy cider, and have the tannins. I mean, you're in a region of the world that just has magnificent apples for making cider, no matter how you make it. It's kind of hard to do it wrong. But in this case, you're bringing those different vintages along. So can we assume you have a little bit of wild yeast fermentation and, I'm going to say, cultured yeast fermentation going on here? Is that from different vintages? One might have a blend of both. Can you give us a little bit of background on the making of this particular cider?
Yeah, so all of our apples are high in tannin because we only use cider apples. We have 8 varieties in our single orchard that we grow. Principally, it's the Dabinet apple, which is a relatively common southwest cider apple, and we pick that in the late season. We have other varieties as well, but the Dabinet is probably our main one. In terms of yeast, we use a wine yeast. We don't really use wild yeasts that much. And we tend to try and stick to using the same yeast. We like a little bit of consistency, and we don't want things to get too variable. So I think we have a wine yeast that we use, and we try and use the same one.
Okay, very good. I think I want to maybe do a little recording with Bob Cork and kind of go into the specifics on that. I don't know if that's possible at some point, but
Absolutely.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that at the end of this when we go offline.
I've never met a man more knowledgeable on cider. It's quite ridiculous.
Lovely, yeah. I'm sure all the folks that are surrounding your operation there are really highly skilled in what you're doing, because of this. The amount of what you're doing is really commendable. So getting back to the triple vintage, 3 different vintages in this one. This is the second one. You already produced an earlier version of this earlier years, so like 2017 going up, right? And so this is the second one that came out, and it's primarily accessed in England, or?
Yes, so we only are making pretty small batches of this. And like you said, because we have a large mill, we're able to store the vintages. So we're quite fortunate, probably different to other cider makers, that we have the tank space to be able to store all the different vintages. And so we make small batches and really are only selling in the UK. A friend of mine imports craft beers into Hong Kong, and he's taken some showerings out there. So I don't know exactly where it's available, but technically it's available in Hong Kong somewhere.
Okay.
But predominantly the UK. We obviously have our website at showeringcider.com, and we work with top chefs and bars and restaurants. So we're actually in half of the 3 Michelin star restaurants in the country, which is just phenomenal, really, because to get that endorsement from quite literally the half of the best chefs in the whole country is just a good feeling, to sort of know that this idea of introducing people to good cider isn't just something that we're thinking. It's being endorsed by the best chefs in the country, like Simon Rogan, who has a 3-Michelin-star restaurant up in Longclume, which is a village called Cartmel near the Lake District. He is a big fan of Showerings, and he serves it in his restaurant. Alain Roux from the Roux family, who are in the UK anyway, they're incredibly well respected and arguably the biggest food family there is. Alain is also a very big fan and sells it alongside his cheeses at the Waterside Inn, which is in Bray. And we work with a collection of really, really lovely restaurants in London. And it's an interesting one because obviously, like I said before, the Southwest is where all the ciders, well, not all, but most of the cider's drunk. But because of the market we're going after and the slightly higher end nature of Showerings and the price of it, because it is more expensive than your mainstream cider, we're having to go to London a little bit, because if you walk down the street in London, you're going to come across a handful of lovely restaurants in about 2 minutes. Whereas in Somerset, there are some incredible restaurants, but they're a little bit sparser and far and few between. So we've decided to try and push Showerings a little bit in London. And that's where we're getting the success, and trying to introduce people to not only fine cider, but also cider. And it seems to be going well. Yeah, I mean, places like the Savoy, the Corinthia Hotel, places like Selfridges, these places have taken the cider, and importantly, it's selling well. So it's not like they take it and then after a few months, sorry, no, it's not interested. It's going in and it's performing well. So really, really encouraging.
So let's get into that definition of fine cider, because this is something that gets thrown out. But for somebody who doesn't understand that, the difference between artisanal cider, fine cider, is it the same? What is fine cider as a definition for you?
Well, I think these definitions can sometimes be a little bit subjective. I think that's important to note. You do get, like you said, scrumpy cider and farm cider, which has connotations, but it doesn't have any legal definition or anything. It's just the taste and the way it's made. So obviously farm cider will be made on a farm quite rustically. You might not even know the ABV of it. You won't know how strong it's going to be. Each batch will vary, and it will be very, very intense and challenging flavor. For me, fine cider is quite a nice analogy, is going back to this craft beer thing, where craft beer became this term that was referred to people who were passionate about making beer and almost had a no expense spared attitude to making beer. So they weren't worried about charging twice as much for the beer they're making. And it's almost an embodied lifestyle, I think. So a lot of the craft brewers, they were setting up breweries and still are, and realizing that they're not doing it for the money. They're not doing it to make a career out of it or a success of a brand. They were doing it because it's a lifestyle for them. It's a passion. And I think that is the similarities to what I would call a fine cider, where it's someone who is passionate about the product, in our case cider, and is not conscious about making it cheaply. They want to make the best thing that they possibly can in a product that they're proud of. And interestingly, in the UK, you can make cider with, legally call something cider with, I think, 30% apple juice, which is absolutely crazy in a way, because you could be drinking what is called a cider, and the fermented sugars are coming from 30% apple juice. Obviously, we use 100% fresh juice and always will do. But I think those are the sort of differences where little details can differentiate between what's a fine cider and what's a mainstream. But I think ultimately it's a subjective term, but really it's about the care and passion that goes into the making.
Yes, very well said. And I think it's good for listeners to know that this is 100% juice of the apple here. And just a beautiful label presentation. It does, the name is right out there. You definitely have name recognition, and it has kind of like that gold standard type. It stands out on the shelf. It has a little bit of regalness to it. And that's exactly what you want. A bottle that's sitting on the table, and the S for the last name here. There's a relief here for the Showering name on the bottle itself, and it's a 375 mil. This is the primary size that you're making this in.
Yep. So we only do one bottle size, 375, and the reason for that is the sort of the subtle connotations with wine, so it's half a wine bottle. And absolutely ideally, one bottle shared between two over supper or lunch is really the way to drink it. In a wine glass, always in a wine glass. And so there are these little cues to wine because, like I said before, this is where I think it's really interesting, is that this occasion where wine has dominated, maybe cider can reintroduce itself into that.
Oh, absolutely. And what a great time, because there's so many craft makers out there right now who are really on this trend to really elevate cider. And certainly coming out of the UK, the timing is perfect. Now, this particular cider is 6.8%. And on the back of the bottle here, it talks a little bit about the Davenet here and Somerset and the region and a bit of the history. So you have a nice story on the bottle itself. So there's a lot of good information and a little bit more to be had there too. I love that it says grown in Somerset, crafted in Somerset. So you're really owning the area, the tradition. I think if I was from Somerset, I would feel a certain unity there. And I think that's important in this craft market right now, specifically for cider. We know that the Davenet, which is just like a premier apple, everybody here in the U.S. always tries to have a little Davenet in the orchard. Does it grow well? No. Would it taste the same way as a Davenet in the U.K.? In my mind, absolutely not, specifically in the cider. So when you're getting it from like the homeland in that way, it really pops. What is some of the profile that one can expect in the taste of this particular cider?
I think the most interesting thing with Showerings and the feedback that I've had is the length of it. So it sits on the mouth for a very long time. And I've had sommeliers in London, top sommeliers, comment on that and say, well, this is actually quite mind-blowing because it tends to be the worst quality, the wine. You'll drink it and then a few seconds later, your mouth has lost all flavor. And there's actually a reason for that because, you know, if you think of Prosecco occasions in the UK especially, it's drink, order another bottle, drink. So the shorter the mouth, the length, the quicker you tend to drink something. And so the finer wines will traditionally always have a very long length on them. So you're actually enjoying the wine for a very long time. And so you're not having to always reach for the glass. You're not naturally reaching the glass. And that's a comment that's been made on Showerings, which I'm very proud of, is that the mouthfeel and the length is very long, similar to fine wine. So that's definitely something to look out for. I think there's a real body to it. And what's been very important to us, and I touched on it about this balance of challenging versus being able to introduce non-cider drinkers. But what's very important to me is that we're true to our region. So with cider, similarly to wine, every region has its own style. So Hereford will be different. The southwest will be very different. The east side of the UK will be very different. You know, France is making ciders that will be different to what we're doing. Same with Spain. I'm sure the same in America and South Africa. So the region that you come from is very important, and we've stayed true to our Somerset region. So when you try the Showerings, if you know about cider, you will be able to identify, oh, that's the southwest of England cider. You'll be able to notice the tannins, the acidity, but while keeping it quite delicate. The colour's very dark compared to your traditional majority of ciders, and that's because of the aging. So the longer we age, the darker it becomes. So people often comment on the colour in a positive way. It's very lightly sparkling because we don't want to overpower people with the bubbles and the sparkle to distract from the flavour and the enjoyment. So we've tried to balance that a little bit, because sometimes when you go to a pub in the UK, get a pint of cider, you're just hit with pure bubbles and you're not really able to enjoy the product. So we've gone with slightly lighter carbonation and just so that you can really enjoy the flavour. There's tasting notes of cedarwood, and there's quite an oaky taste to the cider and woody. And we actually don't age in wood because we feel like that will become too much of a dominant tasting note within the liquid. And so we age in stainless steel. But when you try it, you'll really be able to pick up on the woody notes. And that purely comes from the apples and the trees itself. There's notes of apricot and vanilla as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of stone fruit comes through, which is quite interesting.
Well, let's open this bottle here. You have it on your
Okay,
side of the country. I have on my
here
side
we
of the
go.
world.
Yeah.
A little bit of a hoof there. And you could see that beautiful, beautiful copper color. Just
Mm,
absolutely stunning. And the little delicate bubbles, they're just going, bubbles that go just straight up in like a linear style, just absolutely gorgeous. So I'm going to say from the US to the UK, cheers.
cheers, cheers. And the nose, you do get a little bit of that southwest farmy nod to farm cider. You can say it's very
A little bit of like leather, on the nose, that richness. And you could tell that there's depth. Just on the nose, it pops out. A full-bodied cider has the bouquet that is bouncing out of the glass. It could kind of fill the room in a way with that apple, too.
always reminds me of home.
Uh,
Honestly, it's crazy.
I'm
It really
sure.
does. Yeah.
I'm sure it does. What's interesting about this cider, and I find it absolutely delicious, this is a cider that makes you take notice and stands out. If somebody poured it and they handed it to you and you took a sip, you would have pause. And that's what I look for in a fine cider, something that's going to not make me overthink. And I go, wow, that's the Dabinet really cranking out there. You really get that tannin and that apricot.
Well, it's always one of my favorite things is when someone's never tried showerings and they say they don't like cider, getting them to try one and then seeing their facial expression when they're like, oh, well, actually, no, I'd drink that.
That's the
That's
best.
always quite a nice feeling. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's not a flabby cider. It has a full mouth feel. The tannins are lingering at the top of my mouth. It's not forward. It's like a full mouth experience and want to be savored. So well done. Well done to all of you.
Thank you very much. Well, the food thing is very interesting because cider, I believe, can do things where sometimes wine can't, especially with spicy food. And I think the cider goes incredibly well with a slightly spicier dish. And the traditional, slightly fattier, like pork dishes and things also go incredibly well. So if you can somehow combine pork or something slightly with a bit of fat on it with spice and pair showerings with it, it is honestly delightful. It's quite an experience. And thank you for the compliments. I mean, we've been very lucky, but we've won awards at every competition we've entered, which is amazing, ranging from international cider competition to the international wine spirits competition, getting a Great Taste Award, which is in the UK a very prestigious award for brands, not just alcohol. And funnily enough, probably the award we're always most proud of is 10 minutes away from where we're based. There's a competition called the Bath and West, which is a farmers competition. It's local. So if you don't live in Somerset, you won't have heard of it. But
we know about it. We know about it.
Oh, you do?
Oh, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, actually, the competition is held in the Showerings Pavilion. So they're not biased because of that, but that's just a legacy thing that my ancestors did with them. And it's just a fantastic competition because it champions everything Southwest and farming. And, you have competitions ranging from cracked egg yolks. So you have a table full of cracked egg yolks so you can judge who's making the best eggs. And when we won gold this year it was a very prestigious award for us because really, although the rest of the UK, and unless you're a cider connoisseur, you might not have heard of it, for us it's very important because that is really where the best cider makers are and the best judges of cider are. So to win that this year to win gold there we're really happy about.
Well, congratulations for that. That's a big win indeed. And definitely the listeners out there in Ciderville know about that prestigious show. And it's following the UK along very closely, which leads me to my next question about the evolving market in the UK. I guess this is the way that you're adapting to that. You're seeing probably a market that is, going towards gluten-free, maybe lower alcohol. It's half the alcohol of wine. And it's also the new kid on the block, but not. So can you tell us and fill in some of the dots there on the consumers and what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So My knowledge of the rest of the world is not great, but I can tell you what's going on in the UK. And the big story at the moment is the cost of living crisis. And what that means is that inflation and costs have outstripped what's going into people's wallet. People are earning the same amount or similar, but the costs have really ramped up in the past couple of years. So what that's meant is that disposable income is at really an all-time low, and people are struggling to afford to go out and go for their nice dinners, go for their drinks that they might do 2-3 times a week, and they're having to really limit that occasion. Interestingly, you would think that that would mean people are defaulting to the cheaper drinks, and then they're excluding the more expensive drinks. And we're not in the same price of champagne, and so we're not really a super unobtainable product, but compared to cider, we are very expensive. But what we're finding, the consumer is preferring to spend less on more drinks, but they would rather save it for like a bit of a special occasion or a special treat. So actually, we're in a very good position because there's big research done, and I've got the data that people would rather go out and spend all of their money on 1 or 2 nice drinks and just call it an evening, have a lovely evening, rather than spend lots of money on maybe 6 cheaper drinks. So that cost of living and the tightening of budgets has led people to reward themselves when they want to go out, and they want to really make an occasion of it. And in order to make an occasion, you're probably picking somewhere nicer to go to eat, nicer drinks to have, rather than let's go out and have a night that we probably won't remember and drink 6 pints of mainstream cider. So even though the times are quite tough for hospitality and the drinks industry, we're actually, fun enough, in quite a good position. And so that's what we're finding. And this low ABV movement is also a very interesting point that you made, that it's a very small market, a very small segment of the market. So there's a lot of growth in low and no alcohol in the UK, but it's from a very small position. So people are getting very excited about it, but it's still a little bit too soon, I think, to really say that it's, an established market yet. But, you've got to keep an eye on it. But like you said, Showerings is the perfect alternative to, if you don't want to open a bottle of wine in the evening, or you don't want to have a full, 12% glass of wine when you're out, Showerings is half the ABV. You can have a couple of glasses of this and you're still getting the same alcohol input. So we're actually very, very well positioned for both of those things. But like you said, new kid on the block, but not. And I think we're also not, and it sounds funny to say, but we're not too worried about the wider market and things like that. We're quite internally focused, if you like. We focus on making the best cider we possibly can. And if we do that, someone's going to drink it. So that's kind of our mission.
Yeah, and you're well, situated to be able to do that, which is definitely a luxury. And why not seize that luxury too? So in terms of the consumers, they are, I absolutely agree, looking for also smaller format bottles. Even if you're not going out with a dinner date, and there's a lot of single people out there or who want to have a cider, they could open this and enjoy it, or bring it, whether it's in a Michelin star restaurant or out hiking and having a nice picnic. We have, outdoor concerts here at Tanglewood in the Berkshires and Lennox. A perfect cider to bring because it sits in your glass. And that's what I really enjoy about a cider like this. It really sits, it has a complexity, and it's nice to look at. So definitely drink it in a clear glass. We are drinking it out of both wine glasses here, pretty larger wine glass. It's clear, so you can really continue to see those small little bubbles popping up, which is nice. Those small bubbles, a perfect carbonation level too. And imagine this is forced carbonated.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Right. So perfect balance there.
And we suggest wine glass just really for all the benefits that a wine glass brings. So you get the nice balanced rim for the correct amount of aeration. You can swirl it. The stem to drink from will keep it cool. And we suggest actually probably an oversized red as the rim size, because people may already know this, but the size of the rim of the wine glass is very important to the drink you're drinking for the concentration of nose that you get. And the mouth can only taste 4 things. So really all of the taste is coming through the nose. So that is incredibly important. And so we suggest an oversized red in an ideal world, even though that's not what I'm drinking from. But
Right. It's going to taste good in any glass, but if you could do that, definitely do that. And it just makes it more fun. And cider is fun, and it's something to be enjoyed and to like treat yourself, as you say. I love that. Let's talk a little bit about the future. Is this the path to continue with the triple vintage? You're well situated for it. It's unusual that a brand has one cider that they're rolling out each year. It's partly because of your market positioning, but what do you see as the future here, Nick?
Well, when we set out for the Showerings, doing the Showerings triple vintage, our ambition was really to make the best cider we possibly can, and hopefully one day make the best cider in the world. And that's really genuinely our mission with this, and that's what we always remind ourselves. So I don't think we will ever bring out other variants or other styles of cider, because it would undermine that a little bit. And obviously, if you were to venture into other completely different, like maybe you to do a Perry, then I think that's doable, because they're obviously different drinks. But
I'm very happy to hear that.
yeah.
But I think,
Yeah, I mean, a Perry would be good, but I think we're very focused on making one batch, and it is the best cider that we can make at that time. So we don't want to distract ourselves from coming up with different variants and different sweetness levels, and we just want to do what we think is the absolute best and stay focused on that, because sometimes when you do one thing, you tend to do it better. So yeah, our ambition is very much to make the best cider we possibly can, so we always stick to one. And we like bottles because it tends to be drunk in the wine glass rather than by the pint. And as soon as you go into kegs and draft, you are susceptible to slipping into that cost battle and people drinking it by the pint on a night out and not enjoying it as much. Which, interestingly, actually, I would say I went to go watch Chelsea play football. I'm actually an Arsenal fan, but I went with a friend, and he's just come back from Houston, and he knows I make cider, obviously, and he said, like, you won't believe it, but the amount of cider that's getting drunk out there is ridiculous. And I don't know much about the American market, but it was really interesting to me. I was like, I just didn't think. And he obviously was having nights out and things, and he noticed that cider was being drunk everywhere. So might have to look into that. Might have to start sending some showerings out there.
Yes, absolutely. I'll talk to you a little bit about that after we go off session here, which is really, we're going to kind of be coming to a close of our interview here now. But I just want to note that this is a good opportunity to go to the UK and to try the cider there and to seek out Showerings Triple Vintage. And obviously it is spread out. If you're going to do some fine dining, which one should do when visiting the UK, you can now get this bottle at many of the restaurants. And we'll have links in the show notes to Showerings website and some of the touchstones there. And how exciting that you are taking on the helm here. The fact that you are passionate about it and bringing it forward at this level is really something that I know the global cider world in general is really happy to do.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words. It's been a pleasure. It's been a joy to talk to you and spread the word of cider a little bit. But yeah, no, I'm very fortunate, actually. Sunday evenings are sort of, feels like, it's very weird to say, but Sunday evenings I love because it feels like almost Christmas Eve, because Monday morning I get to work again. And it's a very fulfilling time for me, which I think is always a good sign. And yeah, I'll keep plugging the good word of cider. And I think the more interestingly, the more people that are involved in this movement, the better, because a rising tide brings all ships up. So yeah, let's watch this space. But thank you very much for having me on, and it's been a pleasure.
Go to ciderchat.com and look up episode 425. You can put in the little search box showering, and up will come that episode, and you'll be able to find links to their website and more, along with photos of Nick showering. He is really taking this brand to that next level, and I'm excited for the family. I think what is true is that my experience in talking to a lot of different families out there in the world, generational families. I mean, on the French Cider Tour, we're going to be visiting Patrice Giard, and his daughter Estelle is now taking on the family's legacy of cider making, she's the 14th generation doing that. So that's right up there with the Showerings or the Martinellis out in California, in Watsonville. Their family's been making cider now for close to the same amount of time as the Showerings, quite frankly. And how they kind of turn over that legacy each year, who takes the helm and what innovation is happening. So very excited to make contact with Nick. And guess what? Now to share with you a little bit about why I'm going to the UK. It's really a research project to see the viability of offering a UK cider tour there for 2025. Yes, Ciderville, I have listened to you. I have heard your ask, like, when are you offering a cider tour to the UK? Well, this is my trip over to go and see that. I can't just offer a cider tour without putting boots on the ground, so to speak, and walking about and getting lost in the countryside and really finding the right little medley to offer to you out there to make your time worthwhile to visit the UK. Because I know you could do it alone. I know that people speak English quite broadly, so it's a little bit different than going to France. But there's a certain reason why people come on the Totally Cider tours, and you'll be hearing a little bit more about that coming up as we are, making our way through France. But more so to really not only look at cider, but to look at the culture, the sites, what inspires the makers there, and to blend that all through the trip so that we provide the best possible charcuterie board, if you will, that cider has to offer and the people there have to offer to you out there. Because I do think it's a region that not only Somerset, but of course Herefordshire, Gloucestershire, Wales, and also going to even the east of London. There's cider happening all around England. And yeah, we're going to be doing a little bit of a deep dive in there. And to top it off, Nick and I set up an interview with Bob Cork. So I will be going to Shepton Mallet and meeting Bob Cork. I hope I get a little selfie with the Babycham. The little reindeer that they had, the icon is actually a giant statue that's in Cliver Court, as far as I understand, which is right across the street from this massive mill. So if you see this American walking around, a Yank, do say hi and reach out if you're in the UK. I'm also going to be going to the Newt, which is in Somerset. It's kind of a bougie hotel, but guess what? They also make cider there. They have a gorgeous, gorgeous grounds. And talking to Charlie there and checking out that scene, doing a little loop-de-loop. I'll be sharing more along the way, but in the meanwhile, we're going to just take one step at a time so I don't go too far out with all my excitement. I'm in France enjoying that and going to be welcoming the folks there and having some amazing interviews from French makers and a Michelin star chef. So, yeah, good cider chat coming up to share with you. So as Nick Showering says, watch this space. And with that, I leave you here. This is Ria Windcaller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
Drink it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this.
Yeehaw!